the end of the presentation, please put your questions in the question box. And the presentation slides are available to download as a PDF in the handout box.
All right, Tine koto katoa, and greetings to our international audience. Welcome to WSP's latest Snack and Learn webinar, Climate Scenarios Toolkit, Improving Policy, Strategy, and Decision Making. I'm Matt Raeburn. I'm WSP's Climate Change Scenarios and Disclosures Lead in Asia Pacific and a principal on WSP's Strategic Advisory Team. I'm originally from New York, but based in beautiful Te Whanganui Atara, Ataroa. That's the Te Reo Maori, translation for Wellington, New Zealand. It's 8 a.m. in New Zealand and 4 p.m. in New York. I hope it's snack time or tea time, wherever each of you are. And I'll ask Chau to introduce herself.
Kia ora everyone, my name's Chau Nguyen. I'm WSP's Digital Advisory Lead for New Zealand. I sit within WSP's Strategic Advisory Team, originally from London and now based in Christchurch in the South Island.
Thanks, Chau. So today we'll share some examples of how we've approached the development and use of future scenarios, specifically climate change scenarios. We'll spend most of our time on the New Zealand Ministry for the Environment's Digital Climate Scenarios Toolkit. The Ministry for the Environment and WSP launched that Climate Change Scenarios Toolkit last week. We'll also highlight how we use WSP's Future Ready research to develop scenarios. Future Ready is an approach developed in the UK that applies research to determine future implications of key global and local trends across climate, society, technology, resources, and the implications of those on the built and natural environment. And just before we get to questions, I'll briefly explain how we've tried to simplify guidance and standards to facilitate a process called climate change scenario analysis. Scenario analysis helps to make policies, strategy, and decisions more resilient to a range of plausible futures. There are lessons here for other markets besides New Zealand. Chau and I relocated to New Zealand from the UK and US respectively. New Zealand is a much smaller market with much smaller project teams and smaller budgets. So out of necessity, we need to find efficiencies to do this kind of work. So after this session, what we hope you'll be able to take away is an understanding of how future scenarios can inform policy, strategies, and decision-making, an understanding of how our approaches to simplifying the development of scenarios and analysis and how to make it more accessible, and an appreciation of how visual tools in particular can make the scenario development and analysis process more efficient and cost-effective. So let's speak first to our featured case study, the Climate Scenarios Toolkit for the New Zealand Ministry for the Environment. Just a bit of background, WSP's roots in New Zealand go back 150 years to the government's Ministry of Works. And before the Ministry for the Environment was a client of WSP, I actually worked there. So 5 years ago, my Ministry for the Environment colleagues and I were already talking about the toolkit or a version of it that the ministry launched last Thursday as the Climate Change Scenarios Toolkit. And so it's great to have been trusted by the Ministry for the Environment to develop this with them as part of the WSP team. The process of using climate scenarios, called climate scenario analysis, is something that can and should be freely available and made accessible to non-experts. And the Ministry for the Environment's aim with this toolkit was to make climate scenarios available specifically to New Zealand central government officials and decision makers in there. So it's not specifically intended for use by local councils or businesses. It's not for use in preparing climate-related financial disclosures. I'll talk more about that later. But you might find that you get something out of this even if you're not part of New Zealand central governments. So for a bit of context for those who are not familiar with what scenarios are and why the airplane, well, it's because climate change scenario analysis is to your government or business strategy what a wind tunnel is to an aircraft design. You want to learn whether your strategy, policies, or decisions, are they resilient? Are they of sound design before you experience turbulence? And climate change scenario analysis, when used correctly, allows you to do that. So climate scenarios are plausible and challenging stories about how the future may unfold. They can be at the global level, they can be at the national level in New Zealand or in other countries, they can be at the sector level of like an economic sector, or they can be at the organizational level. And they have to be plausible, so that's more than just possible, and they have to be challenging, but they're not supposed to be apocalyptic. They still need to be useful for supporting decision-making and for testing policies in the case of the MFE toolkit. They're not forecasts, they're not projections, they're not predictions. We're not talking about what's probabilistic or likely. It's just too difficult to predict exactly how climate change will affect us in the future. There are too many social, political, economic, and cultural factors at play. But the scenarios are a way to consider those factors, as well as different levels of warming, differences in policies, social and economic developments. And before I talk through the Climate Scenarios Toolkit and how it can be used, Chau is going to talk a bit about the digital development process.
Thanks, Matt. So we co-designed the Ministry for Environment Climate Scenarios Toolkit, which was launched last Thursday, so please look for it online. So an important outcome of this project was that MFA fully owned the toolkit, so they fully owned the intellectual property, and they were also able to maintain and support the ongoing updates needed for the toolkit using in-house resources. So at the end of the project, when WSP are no longer part of the project, their teams are now able to manage, maintain, and support the toolkit moving forward. So the toolkit was designed to leverage their existing IT infrastructure and content management system in a safe and secure environment without having to invest in new technologies. And we developed it using a co-development process. So with changes to the content and user experience, MFE are now able, as new scenarios are published, to manage that and maintain that themselves.
Thanks, Chau. So yeah, just to emphasize, this is not a rent-sinking project. We provided this to MFE, and now they're free to do with it as they please, which is, I think, really important to a lot of clients to not be locked into having to work with a specific consultant going forward, which I can certainly understand having been on the client side. So before I go back to how the toolkit works, I just again want to emphasize this metaphor for the process of developing climate scenarios. It's storytelling. It ends up with scenarios that often have like a theme. They can usually be summed up in a thematic name. It's a narrative that tells a story with a sequence of events. So there's the plot, there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. There are characters, there's a setting. These stories need to be coherent. There shouldn't be any plot holes. You need to understand who your characters are, how they're motivated, what's driving the action. And climate scenarios are designed to address some of the strategic considerations, but they do have limitations. More conventional climate change scenarios, for example, have been critiqued as being overly optimistic about GDP growth, even in some of the scenarios where global mean temperature can rise by several degrees. And so for that reason, it's very important to understand the assumptions underlying each scenario and the limitations of each scenario. And in developing this Climate Scenarios Toolkit, when we've included existing scenarios, we made sure to clearly identify those limitations. So why are we developing and using climate scenarios? It's to help clients, and in this case, central government agencies specifically, to think more coherently about the complex interplay between driving forces under multiple scenarios and across those multiple alternative scenarios. Makes it easier to explain scenarios to stakeholder and user communities. Again, we're trying to make this accessible to the layperson. The toolkit can make the scenarios more useful, in particular to organizations, leaders and managers who contribute to strategic, financial, operational planning. It also provides guidance on additional assumptions to be made in a detailed planning analysis. But no single scenario can possibly respond to the wide variety of informational and data needs of different users within an organization and its external constituencies. So that is what scenarios are and how they work. So this is an example of an existing scenario. These are scenarios developed by the New Zealand Independent Climate Change Commission, one of the sets of existing scenarios. that have been developed. Those scenarios are specifically for testing policy and decision-making using plausible climate futures. And we've tried to pair these existing scenarios with simple how-to guidance that can help government officials or anybody using the toolkit to both select relevant climate scenarios and resources, because we provide detailed summaries of existing ones, including at the global level, national ones like the Climate Change Commission scenarios, also New Zealand sector scenarios, building and property sector, marine sector, tourism sector, among others. We provide information on what each scenario was created for, by who, what the key limitations are. There are links to the full sources of information in each scenario, so you do have to go to the original source of those scenarios to get more information. But there's also a very useful filter of scenarios based on what's most relevant to the user. So there's a link to the toolkit in these presentation slides. Go take a look at it. You can see that you can filter by the type of sector, by whether it's a national sector level or a entity level scenario. There's a range of different options there to help you see what's available to you, depending on what you need to use it for. Now, ideally, and this is just the ideal, you're able to develop your own climate scenarios specific to your organizations, but by and large, people tend to, at the very least, start from existing ones, and the toolkit connects you with the resources that will allow you to either develop your own scenarios or to create your own. But let's start with an example about how this would work with existing scenarios. So let's say you're a policymaker in New Zealand's Ministry for Primary Industries, and your minister has directed you to prepare a refreshed government aquaculture strategy, which currently expires in 2025. And again, this is a hypothetical. This is not necessarily a real policy that is actually being developed, although I imagine they'll want to replace their aquaculture strategy since it expires next year. But let's say you decide to test your strategy that you're developing using marine sector climate scenarios, which were created by marine sector stakeholders and facilitated by a friend of mine, Stephen Gray, now with the Reserve Bank in New Zealand. The marine sector scenarios were one of the first sets of sector scenarios developed in New Zealand, and they're somewhat out of date, but they're still actually quite useful because you can use them as a starting point to identify and explore at a high level climate change related risks and opportunities for aquaculture and fishing here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And you can start to understand some of the sector-wide risks, which may include risks from marine heat waves or thermal stratification, which can block deeper nutrient flows. And from that, you can be made aware of impacts to aquaculture and broader fishing operations because of those climate change impacts. So you can also start to actually understand like what that might mean for the industry. Vessels might need to stay longer at sea in order to make their quotas, which adds fuel and crew costs. You can also use the findings from the analysis to brief then your minister, try to inform that refreshed government aquaculture strategy. And the idea is that by using these multiple scenarios and looking at how the strategy would work under multiple climate change futures, you have a more resilient aquaculture strategy as a result. And you might find that it's more flexible than what came before, or you might find other policy implications, like maybe the fishing quota management system needs to adapt to new realities because species are migrating because of temperature changes or not being able to withstand increasing ocean acidification. So using that, you can develop a strategy that is going to be more resilient, and we hope better informs actions government can take to manage climate change related risks and opportunities and to support the industry to do the same. So I won't go through the process for how to develop a new scenario here. You can go to the toolkit to look at that guidance. But again, the toolkit is it's not a spatial tool. It's not creating bespoke sets of scenarios for each user. Doesn't give you the full array of narrative information and data for every set of scenarios. You can go to those sources. I know the Climate Change Commission has that data available. Not every sector that has developed that scenario will make all of that available. But the toolkit does try to make the process as efficient and accessible as possible. I cannot emphasize enough, though, we've tried to make this efficient, but there's still a time commitment and a commitment to really reading and following the instructions each step of the way. There are right ways and there are very wrong ways to do climate scenario analysis. So follow those instructions because they're there to help you use climate scenarios appropriately and notwithstanding their inherent limitations. And now I'm going to hand it over to Chau, who's going to talk about how we use WSP's Future Ready research to also inform scenarios, particularly in the global context.
Thanks, Matt. So with an ever-changing economic market and climate uncertainty, we've been developing digital tools to support our clients with their resilience strategies. Future Ready is a global WSP strategic planning and design methodology that's been foundational to our formula. It uses a research-led, evidence-based approach. The research enables our clients to understand the future more clearly in a way that allows people to take meaningful action today. So we leverage both primary and secondary research to understand the future implications across 4 key trends: climate, society, technology, and resources, and how they might impact the built and natural environment over the next 20 to 70 years. So each year we develop several future-ready megatrend reports for New Zealand Aotearoa at local city-specific scale. So our most recent report was created for the Auckland region, the largest city in New Zealand, and it provides details based on the needs of the city's demographic. So our report looks to align with New Zealand's culture, regulatory frameworks, increased diverse communities, and the changing dynamics of society and governance. So when conducting scenario planning, it's crucial to consider all of these factors together. Our strategic advisory team have been developing the WSP Future Scenarios methodology over the last few years. So we've worked with clients across the banking, insurance, emergency management sectors, and also now bringing this approach to major infrastructure projects. So this practical methodology brings our megatrend insights to organizations to support informed discussions around scenario drivers. A key part of our approach is bringing leaders across the organization together to co-design narratives for future horizons. Through deep analysis, we look at the potential risks, opportunities, and impacts, also incorporating future persona perspectives. So we bring our local and global thought leaders to understand what the future could hold and what actions our clients should take to become more resilient. So what makes us unique is our ability to bridge together expertise across strategy, policy, operations, and tactical actions, leveraging over 150 years of asset stewardship across every infrastructure sector. As the world becomes more complex, so do the challenges. Our strategic advisory team brings together experts across 3 core pillars: assets, transformation, and investment, to help solve client challenges. I'm honored to be working with such a passionate group of people who are constantly challenging me and the industry for the greater good. So what's next? The WSP Future Ready Challenge through a game of strategy. So we've developed this game to help educate people, non-experts like myself, at all levels. So to help them understand how scenarios work and provide an easy way for people to understand future climate scenarios. The game takes some of the most important scenarios and helps walk through possible mitigation strategies in a simple and fun way. And who doesn't like a competitive game at work? So all of these future-ready scenario techniques that I've shared with you today are proven, cost-effective, accessible, and engaging ways to build capability and resilience into your organizations and help you drive better strategies using quantitative, robust, and evidence-based research.
Thanks, Chau. And I'll just kind of remark on that personas, but I find that to be a really helpful way of taking the companies and agencies we work with through different scenarios. You can do it from the perspective of a certain kind of customer, how they're motivated, but we also do it through non-human personas like a bee, if you want to be able to understand how biodiversity impacts and potentially collapse of ecosystems, impacts to pollinators, the impacts that could have under different scenarios too. So there's a lot of ways to get at this, and I'm going to talk about another one. And again, these are all very qualitative tools. And I really do want to emphasize that you don't necessarily need a quantitative tool, especially early in the maturity of your climate or other future scenario development or analysis process. You really should be starting qualitative. And as long as you're following a robust methodology, which we've integrated into Future Ready and the Climate Scenarios Toolkit, which I'll talk about in the context of the New Zealand External Reporting Board in a second, you are still able to connect with that methodology and be able to explain how you're making decisions based on that. So the quantitative bit, I don't want to say that that's not important. It certainly is important, and it's evidence that's useful for informing decisions and for being able to support decisions that you make, but the qualitative bit is also really important. And so again, that Ministry for the Environment Toolkit for central government agencies, the External Reporting Board is a Crown, independent Crown entity in New Zealand, so it's not really who that Ministry for the Environment Toolkit is intended for. But they are a public entity. I do want to make sure I emphasize, though, again, that the Climate Scenarios Toolkit from the Ministry for the Environment, that's not for preparing mandatory climate-related financial disclosures, which would use in New Zealand the XRB standards, or we'll use the AASB's standards in Australia, the SEC's in the US, the European standards, IFRS international standards, et cetera. All that stems from the international TCFD framework, for those of you who know what that is. So that's not what that toolkit is for. If you're doing mandatory climate-related financial disclosures, use either international or the relevant local standards and guidance. And so the XRB is who produces that in New Zealand using our climate-related disclosure standards, which I'm very proud to say were the first that were passed legislatively in the world. So we're the first country to actually mandate this kind of reporting. And so it was a great and very flattering thing that the XRB chose my WSP team to help facilitate their climate change scenario analysis with a view to publishing their first climate-related disclosures as an organization next year. And applying the XRB's climate standards to them as the standard setter has been really insightful, because public entities like them have some very different incentives than companies or fund managers do. We also work with them, though, as Chau mentioned, than they would under similar climate scenarios. Again, climate scenario analysis to be done well really requires a meaningful time investment from already very busy people. You want to get execs in there, you want to get board members in there. The process is client specific to an extent, so facilitators like me need to customize it to, in this case, the XRB, a small organization that has a broad operating environment and a lot of international stakeholders, and has to consider developments in other jurisdictions and from international organizations. So when we're faced with those kinds of challenges, it's really important to try to simplify the process. And the way that I like to do that, because this is how I think, this is how I learn, I think that's how most people think and learn, is visually. So we take the written guidance, we create these kinds of templates that can be used to do the work of developing climate scenarios and performing scenario analysis. So here you can see a template that we've developed and we'll use with clients and how to prioritize climate change related transition risks and opportunities, talking about timeframes in which they materialize, whether they're material or not. This is all something that we do in order to try to maximize what is always not as much time as we would like with the client's decision makers. But the point of this, and hopefully of everything that you have heard today and what you should take away, is that there's a very useful way of testing the resilience of your policy and scenarios. I'm sorry, your policy, your strategy and decision making by using these climate change scenarios. Like, it really can help you to think about options that had never been considered before. And hopefully you've seen that the development and analysis process can be simplified and made accessible to non-experts. There are so many different tools out there that are already available to make the scenario development and analysis process more efficient and cost-effective. So you don't have to just start from a whiteboard, you don't have to start with a spreadsheet. Start with what's already out there and find ways to build on that and determine what you really need. Because I really would caution against going right to a quantitative tool. That's not always the most effective way to get at the decisions that you need to make. All right, and now I'll take any questions.
Just a reminder, can you put your questions in the question box, and any questions we don't answer today, we will answer by email. Presentation slides are also downloadable as a PDF in the handout box too. So any questions? I'll start with this one. What are the most effective strategies for integrating climate scenarios into policy strategy and decision-making processes?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, that's a really, the process that is applied in developing this Climate Scenarios Toolkit and really applies to the future ready scenarios, all of it. Like the process of developing and using scenarios is one that has been really tested and used with international best practice. Now in the climate context, we have a very step-by-step approach that leads from identifying risks and opportunities, to identifying the impacts, to identifying the financial impacts, to then starting to do things to address it. And in New Zealand, we address that through what's called transition planning, or really more accurately, the transition planning aspects of strategy, because climate strategy is no longer some separate thing. Climate strategy is business strategy. So you can integrate it into all of those different levels by following that process, but take what's already existing, take your asset management plans and integrate it into that. Take your emissions reduction plans, integrate it into that. Take your energy management plans, your operational plans. You're not having to like completely reinvent the wheel. You're probably already doing a lot of things that are helping you to get towards addressing your transition risks and opportunities, or your physical risks and opportunities. You may not be thinking of those as climate-related mitigation measures or adaptation measures, but they may be. So you don't have to start from scratch. You're not starting from a blank slate. Take what's already existing and find ways to integrate it, but use that step-by-step process. It's that way for a reason.
Thanks, Matt. To what extent can businesses leverage this to perform scenario analysis?
Yeah, again, don't use this Climate Scenarios Toolkit to perform scenario analysis if you have to do mandatory climate-related financial disclosures, but you may find that it's useful for informing your strategy nonetheless. So we have about 200 organizations in New Zealand that have to do climate-related financial disclosures, starting mostly with FY24, depending on what their financial year is. So we're starting to see those first mandatory disclosures come out. But you will find that, if you're a member of a sector or multiple sectors, because there are, businesses that will be part of maybe the tourism sector as well as the property and building sector, you should be looking at those sector scenarios to determine what useful aspects you can pull out of that. But ultimately, if you're a business, you probably want to be developing entity level scenarios that are specific to you.
Thanks, Matt. There was a question about sharing the direct link to the toolkit, which we will do after the webinar. Another question, how do the scenarios align with IPCC, RCP, ISSP scenarios?
Yeah, so all of the scenarios, even at the national or sector level, like they all are built on the IPCC scenarios. So they refer to the RCP or SSP combined scenarios. RCP are the representative concentration pathways, levels of radiative forcing, which basically get at how much warming is there going to be. Those were updated recently. We're currently in New Zealand in the process. Our national climate agency, NIWA, is currently downscaling climate projections to the more granular New Zealand level right now. So that those data sets are not out yet, but they may be, we hope, in the next few months. But in the meantime, the scenarios do align with the IPCC scenarios that were developed at the time. So the marine sector scenarios are a little bit older. Those predates the more recent IPCC scenarios. So that's something to keep in mind. But if you're using them in a qualitative, more narrative way, you'll be able to identify where they line up and where you're going to potentially depart as you're developing scenarios, either for a sector or really at the entity level. And as you're doing that, you do want to make sure that the assumptions that are underlying those scenarios remain consistent, that you understand how you're changing them. but they do build all on the IPCC, of course.
Great, thanks, Matt. I think this will be our last question. I know time is tight, but are there any examples that help show how the toolkit works or one uses it?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully that marine sector example was useful. It just came out on Thursday, so we haven't had a lot of case studies yet. But the idea is that there was nothing like this that was currently existing in New Zealand, where it was aggregating everything that was currently out there in one place. There have been scenarios that have come out publicly in the last couple of days, so it's already not completely up to date. And I think Ministry for the Environment says they're going to update it annually at a minimum, but it does aggregate a lot of useful information in one place. And this is not for sophisticated modelers. This is not for people who are experts or specialists in climate change scenario analysis as much. This is for regular people who are performing either policy-making functions or decision-making functions, specifically within central government for this toolkit, to use to be able to stress test or test the resilience of what they're doing in a largely qualitative way. But we hope that it will be very useful, and we've gotten great feedback from the launch event so far. People seem to be really happy with this, and I haven't seen anything like this really internationally either that aggregates things in this way. But if people have examples of that, please do share.
Thanks, Matt. Our contact details are on the screen here. We will answer any of the questions that we haven't been able to answer by email. So thank you very much for your time, and I hope you all have a great evening or day, depending where you are in the world.